Less than a week ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin made his first trip outside the former Soviet Union since his invasion of Ukraine. He left with Moscow and Tehran vowing to strengthen cooperation on international security issues. This week, Vladimir Putin's top deputy is in Africa to take the president's anti-West message directly to the continent. Russia hopes to turn anger and social strife across Africa to its advantage, and it could possibly find a receptive audience. Lavrov's first stop has been Egypt. He is in Congo today and would head to Uganda and Ethiopia next. But even before he began his tour, the Russian minister blamed the West for the grain shortages due to the war in Ukraine. The current food shortages are raising fears of famine in African countries. So during his Africa visit, Lavrov aims to paint Russia as Africa's faithful ally. His visit comes hot on the heels of a landmark deal that Russia and Ukraine signed last week with the United Nations and Turkey, aimed at relieving a global food crisis caused by blocked Black Sea grain deliveries. While the grain shortages were set off by the Russian invasion, Lavrov suggested that Moscow was not the problem. He blames the Western sanctions for it.
One fake story, which I would like to mention here, which is important to this region, is the so-called world food crisis, which is being blamed bluntly, unconditionally on Russia, as if the food crisis started on the day when we launched our special military operation in Ukraine. They were trying to pretend that sanctions do not cover grain, food, and fertilizer. And if you just take a look at the list of sanctions, yes, food was exempted. But what was not exempted was the possibility for the Russian ships to call on the Mediterranean ports. What was not exempted was the possibility of foreign ships to call on the Russian ports to take grain and other food cargo.
Since the beginning of the invasion, the governments in Africa and West Asia have found themselves caught in the middle. Though the African governments have been pressed by the West to condemn the invasion, they intend to maintain access to Russian grain and other exports. They have also been trying to preserve the friendly ties with Russia that in some cases date back to the Soviet era, and also have tried to not pick sides in the conflict. The Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has refused to condemn Moscow as strongly as America wanted. On Sunday, in a meeting with Lavrov, the Egyptian foreign minister had warm words for his counterpart. Egypt is one of the world's top wheat importers. It bought 80% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine last year and has been torn between ties with Moscow and its close relationship with the West. Nearly 30% of Egypt's tourists came from Russia before the war. Russia is even building a $26 billion nuclear power plant in Egypt. Yet, Egypt is also one of the top recipients of U.S. foreign aid. So the Egyptian president is trying to balance relationships with Russia and the West. In other countries of the continent, public opinion has been wavering between support for Ukraine and sympathy with Russia's justification of the invasion. While few African leaders have publicly supported Russia, no African countries have joined American and European sanctions against Moscow. When the head of the African Union met with Vladimir Putin last month, he implored the Russian leader to free up trapped Ukrainian grain and also backed Moscow's arguments that Western sanctions had worsened the food crisis. Russia has been praising African leaders, meanwhile, for resisting the Western pressure to join sanctions. Vladimir Putin casts himself as the leader of a global uprising against the Western hegemony. He has described the Americans and the Europeans as a golden billion multiple times. He says that they live well at the expense of the rest of the world. And experts say this argument could resonate well with the Africans. who resent the West's long history of meddling in their affairs and extracting their resources. The West has also waged a campaign in the region. It is trying to keep the countries from getting too close to Russia. But can Putin's attempts to rally support in Africa outweigh the West's campaign? And for more on this, international affairs expert Kadira Petigora with us from London. Let me ask you first for your assessment of how do you see the African countries trying to balance this need to maintain ties with Russia while also ensuring that the Russian access to the grain imports continues, while also heeding to the pressure imposed by the West to condemn the invasion?
Yes, I think each individual country, how they balance those two forces will really depend on whether the government is representative of its people or whether it's a government that's sort of propped up. So I think if it is a democratic country that you're talking about, a country, a government that has the support of its people, it will try to balance the various interests of its people. So on the one hand, you'd have Western trade and Western aid, and on the other hand, you'd have Russian grain. And I think what might be an outcome of this is countries will be relying less on Western aid and might even look more towards China, because we've seen China already making inroads into Africa. And so if countries are seeking to still trade with Russia and want to avoid the repercussions with the West, they may actually look to China. So I think it's a very kind of difficult situation for the West there.
What does Russia hope to achieve through this Africa visit by Sergei Lavrov?
Well, I think, as you said, it's seeking really to blame the upcoming food shortages on the West. And I think it's really seeking to sort of capitalize on this problem that the West has in terms of its narrative, where on the one hand, Western governments have tried to demonstrate to both local and foreign audiences that they're still in charge and that they're punishing Russia via the sanctions. On the other hand, they're trying to claim to African audiences that the sanctions don't affect Russian food and fertilizer exports. So I think he's really trying to sort of undermine that narrative. At the same time, I think he'd be really trying to capitalize on Africa's memory of colonialism. And he's mentioned that quite a lot. He's talked about the Soviet Union's role in helping national liberation movements. And I think that the Russian analysts would be aware also that there was quite a lot of social media support from Africa when the war first started for Russia. So you saw hashtags like "I stand with Putin," notwithstanding that some of that might have been bots and fake accounts. But I think there is a real push by Russia to evoke that colonial past, and where Russia has been a sort of a small empire which colonized countries surrounding it. Western countries have been great large empires which have actually colonized Africa. So I think when Africa looks back, it doesn't see Russia so much as a colonizer as it sees the West. And that's what he'll be really trying to push.
Kadira, leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us on the broadcast.
Thank you.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.